here's another reason why you want to take control of what you're doing.
Everything kind of funnels into the only winning move is not to play the game.
I don't know, guys. This whole thing sounds pre-recorded.
Well, welcome to episode 46 of the Weather Report. And this is going to be the last weather report of 2024. And we are just graced with our guest today, Julia Coleman, Senator Julia Coleman from the Minnesota State Assembly. And we have her here, and she is a good friend of Ken Madden's, and also Jason is one of her constituents because Jason lives in cold California, which is Minnesota. We want to welcome Julia here, and welcome to the Weather Report. Don't have a lot to say with the intro or anything as far as a monologue or anything like that, because we wanted to get right into this. Julia has graced us with about an hour of her time tonight. She's a family woman, so she's got kids and family to take care of, and we want to make sure that she's able to do everything that she needs to do. But she has graced us with an hour of time. Welcome, Julia, to the Weather Report.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, right. I'll jump in here because, like I said, I've known Julia for quite a few years, and we haven't talked very much other than online for the last few years because I moved out of state. But years ago, before I was doing podcasts or a bunch of artwork and stuff, and Julia was in the Senate, we were both kind of activists in the Tea Party movement that was really, really strong in Minnesota, especially in the Minneapolis Twin City areas. There's two groups. There was Tea Party. Remember Jack and Jake? Those guys ran the Tea Party group, and I ran the Liberty Tea Party Patriots group with Mary Amlaw, who she's still running that group right now to this day. Mm-hmm. But we had met through this kind of thing, and Julie was a person that even at a very young age was incredibly impressive on her feet, talking, speaking truth to power. Really, really good and really an effective speaker for it. And when I found out, because I had moved out of the state by the time you got elected, and I found you got elected, I was so excited. I'm like, there's hope for the state. We've got someone like Julia in there. So again, Julia, welcome to the show. And maybe we could start out just by telling a little bit like where you're from, what district you represent, and how did you go from, you were Miss Minneapolis in... What year was that?
2014, yeah.
2014, yep.
10 years ago.
Yeah, to go from that to being senator, first of all, to be a conservative-minded Miss Minneapolis, that was a feat of strength as far as I'm concerned. That was pretty cool. So I would just like to know a little bit more and just tell people a little bit about your journey, a little bit about your origin.
Thanks for asking. It's been quite the journey. So as you mentioned, in 2014, I was Miss Minneapolis. And to add fuel to what should be a very liberal fire, I also was at the University of Minnesota, obviously living in Minneapolis. And I was pre-med when my advisor said, hey, you need something that stands out on your resume that isn't politically or medically oriented. And my friend was working in the Democratic governor's office at the time for, as you know, Ken, Mark Dayton, pretty lefty. And I knew nothing about politics. I was from a family of my mother's on one side, my father's on the other. And I said, sure, that sounds like it'll stand out on my resume. And so I took the internship. And I immediately fell in love with the world of how government works and the history of our nation. And I thought, okay, I've interned on one side. Now I'm going to go and intern on the other. And so I interned for the Senate Republicans, actually. And that's when I realized I am definitely a Republican. and all of my beliefs align with their belief system. And just how they treated people in general really resonated with me. And so I knew that I wanted to switch my major from pre-med to political science and figured I wanted to spend my life kind of in the background, door knocking, working on campaigns. perhaps working in policy somehow and just doing my part to spread conservatism. And that ended up with me getting a job as the very first reporter for Alpha News, which is the only conservative news organization in Minnesota. And so with that, I got to interview people running for president, including Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Ben Carson, just everyone who showed up at the Iowa State Fair basically that year, and get to interview conservatives and Republican elected leaders for several years. And so that gave me such good insight in how the Minnesota political and legislative process works. After the couple of years there, I figured it was time to work more in the private sector. And I took a job with the Medical Alley Association, which is an association representing all of the big medical companies in Minnesota. And there's hundreds, almost 1,000 medical from companies from giants like Boston Scientific and Medtronic and Mayo to startups right in the Twin Cities in the Medical Alley between Rochester and Minneapolis. And so I got to see how important it was that government got their hands off of the private sector and allowed these startups and huge corporations to do their thing and flourish. And I got to see firsthand how when government got out of the way, lives could literally be saved. Watching some of these medical startups go from someone's garage to becoming something as huge as Medtronic. And so that was such a wonderful experience. While I was there, I got married, moved to Chanhassen, ran for the Chanhassen City Council, got elected there. And I was about 8.5, 9 months pregnant, taking a nap. And I was pregnant with my first boy when I woke up and my phone was blowing up because my state senator, Scott Jensen, announced he was not seeking another term. And so talked about it for a while and really noodled it over and decided, okay, I don't want to be one of those mothers that stays up at night, pacing back and forth, terrified about the direction this country's going in, when I have an opportunity to be right there and roll up my sleeves and have my hands in the action and to help shape this country in a way that I would be proud to pass down to my son. So I announced I was running, and a week later, I had Adam, my first boy. I campaigned with him on my hip for a year. Believe me, there were a lot of people saying you can't do both. You can't be a new mom and a state senator, but there was an equal amount, if not more, people saying, absolutely, you can do both. I'm going to make sure you do both and count me in as part of your village.
Might I jump in for a minute?
Absolutely.
One of the people I'm sure that you might have talked to about that was Senator Michelle Benson, because I worked with Michelle Benson when she was pregnant with her little one. The little what's her name? But
Here.
we were doing the same thing. She was pregnant, out in the rain, door knocking, going door to door, and I remember watching you do the same thing. That we kind of glossed over that, but that's a huge deal. That is a huge deal, because to take on what you were doing and to start to build a new family, you just got married, and your husband's a great guy. That's difficult. That puts a lot of strain on it. So to be able to do that and work through it, I think it's commendable.
Well, thank you. And I felt I could do it because I watched Senator Benson before me do it. And that was huge to me. And I hope that there's other women that watch and say, hey, she did it, so now I can too. And so, yes, I campaigned for a year with my son, and I became the youngest woman ever elected to the Minnesota Senate. 2 weeks later, I found out I was having twins.
Let's pile it on.
Exactly. Yeah. So I swore into office, and the whole time I was so nauseous. And I'm going, don't throw up, don't throw up, don't throw up, don't throw up the whole time. And I about a month after I was sworn in, I found out that because they were identical and shared an attachment to mom, that one twin wasn't, we'll say, connected properly to me. And so I'm in my first session, and the doctor sits me down and says, you need to terminate Charles,
Oh, no.
in order to save James. If you don't, Charles will pass, his blood will clot, and because he's connected to James, James will have a stroke and die. And then your body at some point carrying 2 dead babies will go into shock or sepsis and you will die.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
And I said, what's the other option? And she said, your other option is we take Charles out at 26 weeks. He will be severely mentally and physically disabled, but we'll try our best to save both boys. So what I decided, and with my husband, is we're pro-life and we would never choose between our children like that, and come what may. But we're going to fight and advocate for these little babies. And so every other day we would have to drive to St. Paul and get an ultrasound to make sure they're both still alive, and then come in again every other day and go through that whole same process. And now it's memorable looking back. There's pictures of me with ultrasound going on and I'm voting and I'm testifying on a bill remotely, because this all happened during COVID with remote voting and remote testimony. And so they kept trying to push for that 26-week mark. And we kept saying, you know what? Let the suitcase is packed, but we're going to come back tomorrow and we're going to see how things are looking. And so at midnight on May 17th, we gavelled out of the first legislative session I was in. Noon on May 18th, at 33 weeks, I delivered both my boys perfectly healthy.
Wow.
God bless. Right?
Wow.
There's some prayer happening there.
Absolutely. Awesome. I had a girlfriend who said, my mom had a vision, a dream of a stadium full of people praying for your twins. And that's when I decided to go very public with what I was going through, and kept a blog going about every appointment and the milestones we were making and the steps backwards. The journey didn't quite end there. So they were in the NICU for a month, and their doctor was very politically oriented, knew who I was and what was going on. And I was in the basement of Children's Hospital where the NICU is. There's no cell service down there. There's no windows, nothing. And so he comes in and he says, after a month, Senator, do you want the good news or the bad news? And I'm freaking out internally at that point, thinking somebody needs surgery, but they're going to be okay. What is it? I said, I just want both. He said, well, the good news is both your boys are going to be home by Monday. The bad news is about 20 minutes ago, the governor called a special session for that day. At that point on Monday, we are trying to discharge the babies from the hospital and then get right back into voting for a month-long special session. And our whip at the time calls me and goes, we're going to be up till 2-3 a.m. Are you going to be able to do this? I said, Senator, I have newborn twins. I'm going to be up.
I could be up anyway.
65-year-old members of our caucus, are they going to be up? So, no offense, Bruce. And so,
that's okay. 8:00, I'm done.
He just nodded off a minute ago. If you were watching,
that was my journey from Miss Minneapolis to my first year in the legislature.
Wow.
And it was campaigns and babies and craziness, and it's finally settled down a little bit, and hopefully they all stay sleeping throughout the remainder of this recording.
Oh.
Well, if not, that's perfectly okay. We can have babies on.
Yeah. So if I got that correct, you are still in the medical field, or were in the medical field and doing political science at the same time. Is that correct?
Correct. So I was studying pre-med, I switched to poli-sci. Eventually I was a political reporter, and then I worked in the medical device industry for a bit after that. Now my job titles include mom, state senator, and small business owner.
Wow, you were just juggling like a huge amount of just responsibility and work. I commend you. I'm in awe. A lot of us here, like I said, we juggle our 9 to 5s, we juggle our families, we juggle our side hustles and stuff like that. I just want to commend you, because man, that's a busy schedule.
Well, thank you. I have a phenomenal village. I would say the only parenting advice I have is live near grandparents. That's the only advice I have, is live near grandparents. And I have a massive caffeine addiction. So thank you.
That's always helpful. You mentioned something earlier that I had forgotten about was Alpha News. So you were their first hire, and Alpha News has turned into a really solid organization as far as news goes, as from what I'm seeing. I mean, they're they're reporting the things that the mainstream isn't. And you
Absolutely.
started with that. I mean, you were the one that you were the news person. I remember watching those, and I'm like, I had forgot about that. But
Alpha News has absolutely just taken off, especially under Liz Collins. It has just gone from kind of small time to, I would say it's up there with the major news organizations in the state now. And she's just done phenomenal work with it.
yeah, it's great. I mean, I know that I'm so you're familiar with Joe Souchere and the Garage Logic. I mean, I've been listening to them for 30 some years, but they're consistently quoting Alpha News, and it's really interesting because they are a pretty mainstream. I would call them they're the mainstream right wing radio in Minnesota. As far as a big podcast goes, we've also got the Patriot, AM 1280. That's another good station stuff too. But for Souchere, that's kind of the old guard to be talking about this new news organization, quite a bit. And he's had the woman you just mentioned. I think he's had her on before.
Liz Collins, yeah.
Yes. And it's just great to see. And I forgot that you had started there as their first reporter. So that was a cool story.
Alpha News asks a lot of questions other news organizations don't. In fact, the Curtis Johnson case, which led to the House having a 1-seat Republican majority now, Alpha News was the first group to dig into that. So they have done phenomenal work.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you were the youngest senator to be elected into the assembly in Minnesota. What kind of challenges, number one, of your youth, and number two, as a woman going into politics in Minnesota as a conservative? I mean, there had to be some kind of ladders and steps that you've had to conquer, and the stuffiness of guys like me, 65 years old, going like, whatever. I mean, so I mean, there had to be some kind of those challenges that you can, kind of tell us about, and some of the successes you had.
One of the biggest challenges, I would say, is convincing my own party of the direction we need to go into. They always say we want young people to be a part of our party. But what they mean is we want young people saying and thinking the exact same things we say and think, instead of opening up to other perspectives and growing our tent and saying we agree 75% of the time, whereas the other side we agree with maybe 5% of the time. So let's work together. That's certainly been challenging. On the other hand, it isn't always like that. So unfortunately, I am one of 3 Republican women in the Minnesota Senate. That means there are 30 Republican men. It certainly feels like I have dozens of big brothers. There is very much a you do not mess with Julia Coleman mentality in our caucus, and if you need something, I've got your back. If you need me to help you with something, I've got your back. So on one hand, it is challenging pulling the party inch by inch where I'm hoping we can get to, which I think is more of a libertarian-minded perspective. And we're more open to people that don't necessarily live or think like we do. But on the other hand, it has been phenomenal seeing how embraced I am when I think most people expect it to be the opposite.
Yeah, I could see that. We had Shane Mecklin, Representative Shane Mecklin, and Representative Walter Hudson on in past shows.
Great people.
Yeah, and both of those guys, I knew Walter from the same time you were in the Tea Party stuff when we were doing all that together. Walter was just one of the guys that was always very outspoken. And Shane is just, I mean, if you've ever watched Yellowstone or Landman, Shane just was like one of those guys. He's just a good old boy. Has his truck and his farm and gonna have a beer and a cigarette and tell you what for. But he's not. He'll drag. But he's the same way. He's like, we need to pull people towards the reality. And the people on the left in Minnesota have been doing that for so many years. I mean, I went to Minneapolis College of Art and Design in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was when the AIDS scare was going on. I mean it was an AIDS epidemic. And you imagine in art school in Minneapolis, that was a thing that people were really, really worried about because there was a couple of kids there that died from it. And then the war happened, the first Gulf War. And then we had all these people coming in saying, we're all going to be over a war and no one's going to live through this. We're all getting drafted. And I watched what happens in a college to the groupthink in a college. You know, as someone that's young like yourself, you're not that far out of college. I mean, a while, but the tensions and the things that get ingrained, it's hard to change that when they get out. And now these people are in the legislature. So when you're dealing with people, I think that in the past, it seems like a lot of people would argue and stuff, the left and the right, and then they'd all go out to dinner somewhere and kind of hash things out and be like, boy, that was a rough one today. We really can't do that, what you're thinking, because of this, that. But, you're still a decent person, and let's go, how's your family? And that doesn't seem to be happening as much anymore. And I know that I've heard that from different legislators, especially some of the older ones. Have you seen that as much where, because you are DFL or GOP, you're all people. You're all people in the eyes of God. And to get along, just to go along doesn't make sense. But do you see a divide like in the Senate where it's so much us versus them that it's really hard to get any kind of common ground, even on stuff that makes sense?
It certainly feels more polarized, even from when I was a reporter at Alpha News. I would talk to other members and they would talk about the freshman mixers, which would be a happy hour between all the freshmen and the older members, whether they are on the right or the left. And just when I came in, there was this old guard in the Senate for my first 2 years. We had Senators Bach and Thomasoni. We had Gazelka. We had a lot of people that had been there for a while and were a part of that institution. And the way they talked about how it's changed, it really almost made me feel like I missed out on the golden era of politics and the golden era of being a statesman and not a politician. And when the 2022 election came, all of a sudden we saw this wave of people very extreme on both sides of the aisle enter the legislature. People that were not interested in being statesmen, but were activists with an election certificate. And that's when it stopped being, let's work together, let's be cordial, and it became so much more combative. Really, the only way I see us moving past this is for bases on both sides to accept compromise, to accept when we work together, and to not demand that we become flamethrowers. I'll give you an example. Unfortunately, a woman I absolutely admire, Senator Carrie Dietzick, passed away on Friday from cancer.
Right.
Yeah, it was terrible.
That puts the Senate in a tie for a few weeks. And people are telling us to absolutely burn down the House and take complete advantage of the situation, not recognizing that somebody we all loved and respected died from cancer at a young age. And we want to, yes, fight for what we believe in. Yes, demand bipartisanship. But we do not want to stomp on the grave and take advantage of this horrific situation. And so we still want to keep the humanity in this. I'm a part of a fellowship that really makes people think about the legacy they want to leave behind. And so one of the rules that I've learned from one of my other fellows, if it feels really, really good, you probably shouldn't do it or post it. And so there are moments that I want to be that flamethrower and I want to just play that game as much as I possibly can. I have to remember what my part is in the legacy I'm leaving behind. And so when I have a problem with something a Democrat is doing, I go after the problem or I talk about that person directly. I don't say all Democrats are evil and here's why, because I'm not going to cast aspersions to an entire side of the aisle and in half of America and half of Minnesotans because of one person's actions and one person's vote. Or if I don't like what their entire caucus did, I will say Senate Democrats did X, Y, and Z. I'm very careful in the language that I use. I stand up firmly for what I believe in. I call out corruption. I call out bad ideas, but I don't try to bash an entire side. That's how I think we all need to take personal responsibility in that divide and that inability to work together.
Cool. So in your second term that you've had here, in the first you had Democratic, led assembly floor. So that must be very different than what you're facing this term, where you guys have the Republican advantage on the floor. And also, Walter Husband has been very vocal about the change on the floor, and whether or not he has been as accepting as you have or not. I mean, there's a difference there, I'm sure. But how's that going to be different this time than your first time as a senator in walking that? And I think you've explained that a little bit, but is there going to be like a great big huge difference, or do you have that much of an advantage now on the floor than you didn't have on your first term?
Well, my first term, Democrats controlled the House, Republicans controlled the Senate. We all had to work together. My second term, which is 4 years now, the last 2 years I've experienced, Democrats have controlled all three branches of government.
Mm-hmm.
So for the second half of my second term here, the next 2 years, what happened with the Curtis Johnson case has completely changed the dynamics. Before, it was going to be, after Election Day, a tie in the House, which was historical. But with Curtis Johnson being out, this now allows Republicans to set the committee structure, elect Lisa Dameth as the speaker, I believe set the rules. And so that changes everything, because they can't remove a speaker even when they refill that Curtis Johnson seat with a Democrat. Now, if I were Lisa Dameth, and I know I'm talking about working together and bipartisanship, but we're looking at a deficit. And so our number one goal is financial responsibility this next year. If I were Leader Dameth and soon to be Speaker Dameth, I would, in the first 3 weeks of session, pass a shoestring budget that gets us out of debt, and then gavel out for the rest of the session. Sine die. And the House or the Senate will still be in session at that point. But in order to call a special session, the governor needs sign off from the rest of the leaders, the caucus leaders. And so that puts Lisa Dameth in such a bargaining position to say, I won't even come to gavel us in for the House if you don't work with us and negotiate with us. Because for the last 2 years, it has been us reaching our hands out across the aisle, asking for bipartisanship, asking to work together, and pulling back a mangled hand. And now it's time for us to be the adults in the room that put Minnesotans on good financial paths.
How was it for the last 6 or 9 months that Governor Tim Walz was basically not doing anything for Minnesota? Was it kind of a loose cannon type thing going on in the on the assembly floor, or did it really do anything? And on top of that, how is it going to be working with him now as he's going for re-election in 26, I believe, is when the next election is. How is working with him now compared to as having to work with him before he was picked for a VP selection? Is there any difference at all?
If you read Senator Gazelka's book that he published when Tim Walz was named the vice president candidate, he talks about the difference between how he negotiated with Mark Dayton for a while, the governor prior to Tim Walz, and negotiating with Tim Walz. And the biggest difference was with Mark Dayton, when you had an agreement, you would walk out of the room and know this is the agreement. That was not the case with Governor Walz. And you couldn't trust what he was saying. And I, as somebody who has interacted with him on a number of occasions, was shocked to see the person on the national scene. Who was this person jumping around and acting crazy and talking like this and kind of making a fool of our state?
Yeah.
He'd be embarrassed to say I've worked with him on anything. And so I do think there's going to be a chip on the shoulder moving forward. But seeing how Minnesotans are trending and how unpopular he became once he was a vice presidential candidate, if he continues to have presidential aspirations, which means he'll have to run for a very unprecedented third term for governor in 26, maybe we'll see him singing a different tune of bipartisanship and let's work together and kumbaya and taking more of an Amy Klobuchar approach. We'll have to see what happens come January, because no one's had to work with him yet. We were out of session after he was announced through the election.
That's right. Well, and you got to remember too, you guys that are out of state, Walz was a pretty moderate Democrat when he got in there, and that's the way he governed, was pretty moderately. So when COVID hit and he got a real taste of what power felt like, it went to his head. And we all watched it happen, because in the beginning of COVID, in the first few weeks, the guy was actually making sense. And he came on and he was calming everyone down. Hey, we're just going to try and figure this out, and let's all just chill out for a little while. No one knows what's happening. And for the first 2 weeks, I was going to give him credit, but he just realized we've got gold here. And I think the Democrats across the country realized that too, because the Republicans, we were all of a sudden, like, well, no, hey, liberty, freedoms, that you're all going to die. You're trying to kill grandma. We didn't have an argument for that. We didn't have an argument for that.
Congressman Tim Walz was this pro-gun moderate, just a coach who was kind of a JFK-style Democrat and kind of kept his head down. And as a governor, he started out that way. But especially after they got the trifecta, all of a sudden he became the most liberal governor in the entire country. We became, as Jason was saying earlier, a cold California. And we passed the most extreme agenda we've ever seen. And he absolutely pandered to the far left base that is part of his party. And I think he saw a rejection to that this last go around.
I think so too. And I think he also, what happened in Minnesota is people are starting to wake up a little bit. It looks like, and because there's always been the environmentalists fighting the union guys in northern Minnesota. So northern Minnesota, Bruce, it's some of the most gorgeous country on the face of the earth. It's well protected, and it's also where they mine taconite and iron ore.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the environmentalists up there. You've got tribal people making claims to the land, and now you've also got the people digging and stuff, and they're all on the left. All of those groups are all hard left, and they all support politicians on the hard left quite a bit. They're all infighting because we need resources, and there's resources up there, and there's great ways to get the resources without destroying the land, blah blah blah. But the environmentalists don't want it, the union guys do, and it's caused some cracks in the armor that the Republicans can go now and talk to these mining companies. You're not going to get the environmentalists and lunatics, but the mining companies you can talk to and say, all right, here's what we're going to do. You can't just go out there and just wipe out everything and get your iron or your copper or whatever you go to. There's got to be a way to do it. And the companies are just saying, hey, look, we can do this way, but you've got to get some of these other roadblocks out of the way. And roadblocks kind of things is what the Walz get. They burnt through, Bruce, a $17 billion surplus. Usually there might be a $1 or $2 billion surplus. They had a 17, and they burnt through it. Now they've made and Julia, tell me if I'm wrong on this. Now they've used this money. They've created all these new programs or super funded other programs that now this next year isn't going to be a $17 billion surplus. It's going to be a deficit. But now these things still need to be covered. Nothing's getting cut.
We had an $18 billion surplus, and typically the budget grows between 3 and maybe 7% every biennium. They increased it almost 40% in 1 year.
Yep.
1 year of spending under complete Democrat control. They blew through the surplus. They raised taxes and fees $10 billion, and we are looking at a deficit, and that a $5 billion deficit, and that doesn't include anything we spend this year gets added into that deficit.
Really? Wow.
And so unfortunately, given the cycle of how this goes, is Republicans are going to have to stand up and say, hey, I'm willing to dig in my heels enough to shut the government down if I have to, or the House has to play this game where they gavel out in three weeks while we have the gavel, and then we're going to bring everyone to the negotiating table. But then the news cycle, whether it's the Strib or the Pioneer Press or other liberal media in Minnesota, it's going to be Republicans are blocking the flow of government. Republicans are cutting this program. Republicans are cutting this. But in reality, what we're doing is just trying to clean up the mess that they made. I hate seeing us painted as heartless. I am the last person I would think of when it comes to heartless, but I am practical. And if I were to put my family into that type of financial position, I would have to take my family out of that. And that would include cutting and trying to get creative with what we have and putting in a list of wants versus needs versus like to haves, and taking care of the needs first. And so that's the unfortunate position we're in. And every meeting I have is some organization or group or municipality with their hands out, with very legitimate needs that I have to say, I'm sorry, I am so sorry, but Democrats put us in this position and we have to get ourselves out of it now.
Yeah, California is in a similar position because last year we had $100 billion surplus in California, and they have bled that all the way to the tune of a $73 billion deficit for going into 24-25. And this is all stemmed from just all kinds of different things. Some of us, us voters, voted for, like the stupid bullet train and some other things that were pie in the sky stuff that they did. But for the most part, to go from 100 billion to 175 the other way, where we're in a $75 billion deficit, and you still have Democrats running the state, is astounding to me. And it's like people are just kind of walking in a stupor and going like, well, everything's going to be all right. We're just going to keep voting in the same people over and over and over. And it just doesn't work that way.
Bruce,
how did Minnesota make that hurdle to what you're seeing now?
Well, by make the hurdle, you mean how did Minnesota get to a trifecta, or how did we get to a second house?
Well, how you got to the power that you guys got to now, because now it looks like, obviously I'm in envy of your state legislature, because I haven't had that type of legislature in over 30 years. Not even when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor, who was our last Republican governor, who pretty much turned Democrat by the time he was done. We didn't have that type of Senate. We didn't have that type of assembly floor, and it doesn't look like we're going to have it anytime soon.
So Minnesota is very independent minded. In fact, I'm a Coleman, so this is hard for me to admit, but we had Governor Ventura. We've had very independent elected officials. And Minnesota also has the highest rate of cross-ballot voters in the nation. So people will maybe vote for Kamala Harris, but then they'll vote for a Republican running for state house or something like that. And they'll go back and forth. The highest rate of that in the nation. We are very independent minded. Most of our voters identify as independent. And if you look at a map, we have the circle of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is very blue. And then the rest of the state is red. That kind of balances itself out. Where it gets very interesting are the pockets of purple, which are where Ken was talking about up in the Iron Range, the suburbs, and then little places like St. Cloud and Rochester, kind of hubs throughout the state. And so those purple places are where millions of dollars and tens of thousands of doors are directed. And so I represent one of those purple pockets. And that's because I represent a suburban district in Minnesota. And so it's very interesting because the voters, their mind changes every single election cycle. And I will say, seeing Trump at the top of the ticket turns most of the people in my pocket off of Republicans. However, I had my very far left constituents reaching out to me saying, I can't afford to stretch anymore. I have stretched. I have started Ubering. I have started doing Instacart. I cannot stretch anymore. I don't know how I'm going to afford groceries or Christmas this year. And I started to have an inkling of which way the election was going to go when some of the noisiest, farthest left constituents I have, who I still respectfully engage with, started telling me that were their struggles. And so I think people voted in kind of the James Carville, Bill Clinton mindset of, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
And so the red areas stayed red, the blue areas stayed blue, but our purple pockets throughout the state tended to shift red.
Yep, they did. And this is a good one of the things we talk about quite a bit here is entrepreneurism, controlling your own destiny, and this is an excellent segue into that. As you know, I've been an artist for a long time. I have my own website, and madkstudio.com is where it is if anyone wants to see what I do. But you also you've started something new, which I think in these times of social media, content creators, people that are doing exactly what we're doing right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what your new company's called and what you do?
Absolutely. I started J. Coleman LLC. I have one child whose name starts with a J, so I guess one of them can inherit it. And I am an executive coach. Executive coaching essentially means whether I'm working with an actual executive, somebody who would like to be an executive, a politician, anybody going into any level of a job interview, news anchors, anybody who's on camera, like the four of you gentlemen right now, who wants to have this presence about them. What makes an executive when they walk into the room, everyone's eyes go to them? When they walk into a boardroom, they command attention. When they walk on stage, everyone there is hanging on by the edge of their seats, listening to every single word, leaving inspired. That when they walk out of that interview room, they've got the job because they're the most competent person there, or at least come across that way. When they go on camera, they don't look nervous. When they're in debates, they seem cool, collected, and put together. That is what an executive coach trains people to do. And so that is the company that I have started, which full credit goes to my mother, Polly Meyer Executive Coaching, who has been doing this for 11 years now. In fact, she is now at a point where she is training such big clients, executives, that she said, you should look at getting into this because I need to send the people I don't have time for anymore to somebody I trust. And that's when I started thinking this would be a fantastic use of time, especially training kind of pro bono younger women looking to get into politics. And so for the last year, I've been just quietly taking clients, and now I'm looking to kind of start advertising. I think I'm getting into the swing of things in a point where I feel comfortable saying, okay, I think I can take on more now. And it has been phenomenal watching your clients go from sitting at a meeting, wringing their hands, swiveling in their chairs, not knowing how to dress, not knowing how to put their best foot forward, to walking into a situation and calling me after saying, I absolutely nailed it. You helped me visualize and prepare for every single aspect of what I encountered. And I just love watching their growth over time. And so that's what this company does. And it has been such a joy working with all of these great people.
This is the best time in history to do what you're doing. That with the advent of the one thing that COVID did well was it connected everybody in ways that we never would have been connected before.
Mm-hmm.
I know I do Zoom calls with sometimes there's up to 100 people on a Zoom call that I'm presenting to. And a lot of times we're presenting to a group of people that have been in presentations all day, and it's 3 p.m. They've been on it for 6.5 hours. And everyone comes on, and what do they do in presentations? Hi, my name's John. We make this part. You guys would like this part because it's good. And they don't have, there's no celebration of it. There's no interest in it. So we changed things up. We have a whole multi-camera setup. We did a whole, without having spent a ton of money, but we made a really nice set that we're taking pictures and doing videos anyway. So this was just what we use. And, like the number one difference I would do in Zoom calls is I never look down at the screen. I look at the camera the whole time, because when I'm in this room full of other people and vendors and competitors, I'm the only one that looks like they're paying attention to the person speaking. The only one. And it works. Those little things, those kind of little things on Zoom calls.
Absolutely. I do an entire segment on Zoom because it became so relevant. For example, It doesn't look like I have 3 boys under 6 behind me right now because you want to pay attention to every detail in your background. You wanna make sure you have good lighting. Whether you are male or female, you want powder on your head if you need it and your face because the lighting is going to make everything shine more. You want the camera to be at eye level. One of my favorite things to coach my clients on is there was actually when this applies to Zoom, in the boardroom, in interviews, in debates, in every single aspect of what you can be on, is there was a study where they had a mock trial. They had a defendant, judge, attorneys, and the only thing that switched was they would bring people from the street in to be the jury, and they would run the jury through. And in some scenarios, the defendant would put their hands on top of the table. And in some scenarios, they would put their hands under the table. And I bet you can guess when they were more likely to be convicted guilty by the random people in the jury. It was when their hands were under the table because they seemed like they had something to hide. It's little things like that about how every aspect of your body language, every aspect of what you're putting forward and what's behind you comes to who you are and what you are bringing to the table. Only about 7% of the words coming out of your mouth stick with people. The rest is how you made them feel and how you came across.
So my brick wall back here.
Yeah.
That's not a bad backdrop, actually. I think the only thing it's missing is like a little piece of art or something that's a reflection of your personality. And mine right now says a mom who has a Christmas tree that's full of arts and crafts projects from preschool. I don't get the fancy trees yet.
My tribute to the Joe Rogan experience is basically what it is.
I love it. I love it.
Well, I think that's going to be a wonderful outlook. I agree. It's a rewarding thing when you can have people do that. I know that from starting out doing videos, not knowing anything about anything, and just being the only one in our company that would be willing to get in front of the damn camera. The first ones we did 9 years ago are they're absolutely unwatchable. We actually put them back up once in a while just as a blooper reel to see how bad they were, and people get a kick out of it because now people don't realize that when you go online and you start getting a following, even if you have a following of 200-300 people, those 200-300 people, if they're local to your town, like you're in a Facebook group of your own town and you're constantly on there and you're talking about things, when you go out into town, you are a celebrity of some sort. People are going to know, like, and trust you. And so the more positive you can be in your speech skills and presenting yourself, it's only going to help.
Absolutely. I love how you talk about recognizability because I like to lift incredibly heavy. And I go to the local community center and I have had to like train my face not to reflect how much pain I'm in because I always know people when I'm out at the gym. And to your point of it's so cringe when you go back and watch things, but you're so right in how important that is. For example, when I started with Alpha News, I didn't have to edit my own footage. I had somebody to do that. And eventually they said, hey, we're going to shift things around. You need to learn how to edit your own footage. And it wasn't until I had to watch myself every day that I realized when I got excited about something, this arm started going like this. And I had to train myself to stop. And so you absolutely have to go back and just like an NFL player, watch the tapes, learn from your mistakes, and see how you can do better. As much as it makes you cringe, it is the only way to improve.
There's another whole group of executives and people are doing. I think that your company that you're doing, I'm trying to mince my words here, would be a good addition to it. It's this whole the C-suite fractional management. One of my good friends, Corey, was head of corporate identity at 3M, and they had a whole bunch of layoffs this 2 years ago, year and a half ago, and he was one of them. I mean, he'd been there for 28 years and pretty high up management, and he was one of 6,000 people that got laid off. The whole department went away, and he just looked at it, goes, what am I going to do? And he says, I'm just going to start my own thing and help people in fractional. He was a branding expert, so branding and marketing. So now he goes to companies and he works with them fractionally, so they can't afford to hire a marketing guy like him or a branding expert. That's $250,000 a year. But you know what? They can afford $15,000 for 6 months to help them build a strategy. And part of those strategies being built that he's building the strategy. He's not doing the work. He explains to people, this is what you need to do. But one of the things that he always says people need to do is learn how to speak on camera, learn how to speak to a group, learn how to present, because it's things that don't ever really get taught. So I think that you're putting together a really valuable thing right now that I'll have to put you in touch with him, because I think you guys could work together on some really cool stuff. And he lives in Minnesota. Bonus.
Definitely a bonus.
So, Jason, you are the constituent here, and you are so quiet. Would you like to say something or have some questions for Julia, as we still have her here?
Technically not a constituent of her, constituent of Zach Duckworth, but
lucky you! I love Zach. He's fantastic.
Yes, he ran against Matt Little and he defeated him, which was nice to see. But I don't have any questions at all. I've never met Zach, but I know he did. He skipped my house. Most door knockers do, because around election time, I always put up a vote for nobody yard sign. So I get nobody knocking at my house at all, which is great. So I get to pick who I want to vote for then.
Well, I would say if there were anybody other than myself who would be willing to get an email from a constituent that says, hey, can we grab a beer and chat about politics and my beliefs? It would be Senator Duckworth. He's one of my biggest friends in the Senate. So I would recommend reaching out to him.
I liked his campaign signs because they were of a duck, which is great seemed like a duck hunter.
Well, and now he's got 4 kids that we call the ducklings. So it's great.
Nice.
But you bring up a good point there, Julia. A lot of people just don't reach out, especially to their conservative legislators. And Peggy Scott is a legislator that I worked on one of her I worked on like 4 of her campaigns, and she's been in there for quite a long time. She's been a pretty strong advocate for liberty. And she was one, after her first term, I remember talking to her. I was sitting in her office in the Capitol, and I'm like, what surprised you the most about being here? She goes, I could not ever have imagined the amount of people that come on here with their hand out for this program or that program, especially in the House, because they control the purse strings. And she goes, it's all left-wing agendas. There's no one from the right that even comes in and says hello. I mean, she just, like, for the first 4 years she was there, she goes, it was all people from the left coming in, and they weren't coming in mean. They were coming in singing a song and dance, and they had a great opportunity for you, and this is going to be an excellent program. It's going to help so many people. When she looked at it, it's like, no, it doesn't do any of those things. It's just spending money. So talking to your actual senators, your Congress people, your city council, I think is very, very important, especially at this level, because a lot of times people forget what's going on in their state. And, Julia and what she's doing will have way more impact on your life, Jason, than anything that's happening at the federal level. We all know that, but I just to point that out to people. Contact your local people.
Absolutely contact them. I can't tell you how many times it's come time for a vote, and not one member of my community has shared their opinion with me. And I have a policy where I have never turned down a conversation with a constituent. And sometimes during session, I say, look, this is going to have to be a phone call. I'm stuck in St. Paul. And if you can't get out here, we have to do a phone call. But I have open office hours where I publish in the papers and on social media. Let's have a cup of coffee together. And I do that every single month. I text with voters all the time. I respond to every single email, and I have at least a phone call with everybody who wants to reach out. So if you haven't reached out to your state representative or your state senator yet, get to know them, become a name and a face they recognize and respect, and just respectfully tell them your opinion on issues, because we don't know what people in our district think if they don't tell us.
Right. And if all you hear about is the radical right or left, if that's all you hear about, well, that's what you're going to act on.
Yeah, and exactly.
Yeah. People need to talk to their legislators And it's usually not very hard to do. So,
Yes.
and
I
if it
feel
is
like
hard to do, that says a message too. And then you
Yeah.
find someone that's not hard to talk to.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
feel like I'm the same kind of person that does. I'm the only person that talks to my representatives at all. But it's nice to know that it's open. You have an open door policy. That seems to be the policy that a lot of my representatives have. Although that they are mostly left leaning, they are open to have the suggestions and stuff. And a lot of the public, even in the city council that I go to, the public just doesn't show up. And unless the public shows up and shows an interest in the way that their city, their county, their state is run, then your politician, your elected representative is just going to go by the seat of their pants and who they're influenced by in the lobby or whatever the case may be in their legislature. So I agree with you. If you have an open door policy, use that open door policy.
Absolutely.
And you got to consider this too. And I know you do consider this, Julie. What if someone on the other side has a good idea? How can we work with that good idea? Not everything the left wants to do is bad ideas. Most of their implementation is horrible. But, I agree when you hear some bleeding heart liberal, I'll call them that, say, in a country this rich, people shouldn't be starving in the streets. Let's hug, because I agree with that too. Now let's figure out a way to make this so that we can help the people in the best way that we possibly can. And Tom Emmer, representative in Washington now from Minnesota, I was at a fundraiser for him when he was running for governor, and he brought up something that I wish he would have just expunged on. He was talking about welfare and people on welfare, and he's like, these people are being held down. They are so much better than this. They are strong, smart, able to work, brilliant people, mothers and fathers that are being held down by the system. They're better than that. And I'm like, Tom, why aren't you saying this, screaming this from the rooftops? And he says, because no one will listen. But he was right. And this is the kind of thing, all sides have decent ideas, but you never know if you don't talk to people about them. So, I was the guy that would go on GOCRA days. Remember the gun owners, the Civil Rights Association, those where we all get the red shirts and go in? I'd only go to the Democrat floors. I wouldn't go to the Republican floors. They already knew me. I'm like, yeah, you guys have all spoken at our meetings. I'm going to the Democrat floors, and I'm going to talk to all of the young interns, especially the young women, especially the young attractive women, and say, look, I'm not here to tell you to buy a gun and go shoot I'm just saying, do you ever get walked to your car at the end of a 3 a.m. session? They're like, oh yeah, all the time. We don't walk out there by ourselves. And I said, imagine being able to protect yourself at that point. You can still have someone walk with you, but they're going to be able to protect you with this. Just think about this. It was a different mindset. I wasn't saying I'm there with all the Tea Party regalia and the shirt and a big gun on my side and everything, but I'm talking to them like human beings. I'm like, look, I don't ever want anyone to have a gun that doesn't want one. I'm not one of those guys. And I'm also not one of the people that's going to bring an assault rifle to one of these things and look like an asshole. Pardon my French. But it worked because you could get to the senators at that point. They're like, you know what? This gentleman wants to talk to you. I heard one of them said, he seems kind of reasonable for a Tea Party guy.
That's great. I love that story. And it absolutely highlights the point of show up. And if you can't show up because you live too far away, at least make an attempt to reach out. And your elected officials should be trying to reach out to you too, that whether that's through town halls or open office hours or something along those lines. But please make your voices heard.
Absolutely.
I'll reach out to Drew and just email him. My other representative is Angie Craig, and I don't agree with her in a lot of things.
Congress might be harder to get a hold of, but your state senator and your state house member for sure will be able to get back to you.
My other one is Drew Roach, and he's taking over for Pat Garofalo.
Oh, okay. I haven't met him yet, but I hope he does good work.
So do I. He was campaigning a lot on our Facebook groups, and he was sending out thank you cards to a lot of the registered voters in our area.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great, Julie. Christian, I don't know if you have anything to add in the wonderful world of Kristi Noem that you live in.
Julie, I will say this: you're a voice of calm reason that I wish there was more of in Minnesota. Now that I live in South Dakota, I'm surrounded by calm reason, so it's great. But just keep up the fight. I know there's going to be days. Well, we all know there's going to be days where it's going to be rough. Keep going.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I've been to South Dakota once this last June, and I intend on coming back. It was absolutely phenomenal visiting it.
Yeah. Well, just go to the west side. The east side's kind of boring. The west side is the fun part.
Got it. Good to know.
Well, we'll make sure we thank you, Julie, for Senator Coleman to be here on the Weather Report, and thank you very much for giving us your time today. We're going to give you the last word here and let you kind of promote anything that you want to promote. Let everybody know how to get a hold of you and do all those good things.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for having me. This has been so much fun. I pre-apologize to Ken that I can't join you for the second hour. I have a rude awakening in 7 hours at 5 a.m. and I need my sleep in order to take care of these 3 little munchkins that are on Christmas break right now. But I would just like to say thank you for having me on. And whether you live in Minnesota or not, if you ever want to reach out to your elected official, need help figuring out something in policy, or want to learn more about executive coaching in person or on Zoom, I am very easy to find if you just Google Julia Coleman. I'm on X and Instagram and Facebook. And I believe, Bruce, you mentioned they're going to be putting some links there as well. And
Absolutely.
So the last thing I'll ask is that between working in a pretty blue state and having 3 pretty wild boys, just keep me in your prayers if you feel so inclined for strength and patience and rest.
Absolutely. Well, like, share, subscribe to our podcast. We're going to be back next week with the bonus content that we're going to do immediately after this podcast ends here. And again, we want to thank Senator Julia Coleman for being here, my co-host Jason from Horrible Designs, the dude Christian, and Ken from Mad K Studios. And we're going to see you guys next week. And for those lucky enough to want to be tuning into the bonus content, we'll see you on the other side. So I'll leave you like I leave you every night. You guys have a great night and be good to yourselves. We'll talk to you later. Goodbye.